Victoria Montgomery had grown up understanding that her life was never truly her own. As the sole heiress to Montgomery Global Logistics, one of the largest shipping and distribution empires in North America, every breath she took carried the weight of legacy and expectation. Her childhood had been spent in a sprawling estate where marble hallways echoed with the footsteps of 7 young men who were not family by blood, but had become the center of her father's world. These were the Montgomery scholars, 7 brilliant orphans plucked from poverty and obscurity by her father, Richard Montgomery, a self-made billionaire who believed in cultivating talent regardless of origin. He had found them in foster systems, homeless shelters, underfunded schools across the country. Each possessed exceptional intelligence and drive that Richard recognized and nurtured with the same careful attention most men reserved for prize racehorses. There was Ethan Cole, the strategist with ice-blue eyes who could see 15 moves ahead in any negotiation. Marcus Webb, whose technological genius had already resulted in 3 patents before his 20th birthday. Julian Cross, charismatic and silver-tongued, capable of selling sand in a desert. Nathan Pierce, the financial prodigy who understood market fluctuations like others, understood breathing. Thomas Gray, the operations mastermind who could optimize any system to mathematical perfection. Samuel Ford, whose legal mind could find loopholes in ironclad contracts. And then there was Damian Steele. Damian Steele stood apart from the others, like winter stands apart from other seasons. Where the others showed gratitude for Richard's patronage, Damian displayed only cool competence. Where they engaged with Victoria in polite conversation when required, Damian barely acknowledged her existence. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, sharp cheekbones that gave his face an almost aristocratic severity, and grey eyes that looked through people rather than at them. His brilliance was undeniable, his work ethic legendary, his emotional availability non-existent. Victoria had been captivated by Damian since she was 14 years old, and he was 17, already working on his 2nd degree, while the other scholars finished their 1st. She told herself that his coldness was protection, armor built from whatever trauma had marked his early years before Richard found him. She convinced herself that beneath his ice ran depths of passion waiting for the right person to thaw them. She spent years orbiting him like a moon, desperate for the sun's attention, baking cookies he never ate, waiting outside his study sessions, hoping for a glance he never gave, convincing herself that persistence would eventually crack his indifference. Her father encouraged this obsession with knowing smiles and gentle comments about patience and destiny. The other scholars watched her pathetic devotion with expressions she interpreted as sympathy but never questioned too deeply. And through it all, Damian remained as distant as winter stars, unreachable and unmoved. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday night 3 weeks before her 25th birthday. Victoria had been unable to sleep, restless with anxieties she could not name, and had wandered down to the estate's library, seeking comfort in familiar surroundings. The massive room with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and leather furniture had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in stories of other people's lives and forget the suffocating expectations of her own. She heard voices before she saw anyone, low and conspiratorial, coming from the reading alcove near the fireplace. Victoria moved quietly toward the sound, not intending to eavesdrop, but drawn by curiosity about who else was awake at such an hour. She recognized the voices immediately. All 7 scholars were gathered together, their conversation intense and focused in ways that made her pause behind a marble column rather than announce her presence. What she heard in the following minutes destroyed every assumption she had built her identity around. The scholars were not competing for her affections, as her father had always suggested. They were collaborating, working together with coordinated precision to manipulate every aspect of her life. Ethan was describing the latest strategy to keep Victoria's attention fixed on Damian. discussing her emotional vulnerabilities, like a general discussing enemy weaknesses. Marcus detailed the surveillance he had implemented to track her movements and associations. Julian laughed about how easily she was manipulated by the smallest gestures of attention. But it was Nathan's words that drove the knife deepest. He spoke about Eva Hartley, the fragile foster daughter Richard had taken in 7 years ago when her parents died in a car accident. Eva, who was delicate and soft-spoken, who seemed to float through the mansion like a ghost, who Victoria had always treated with patient kindness despite feeling vaguely threatened by her presence. Nathan described her with reverence and affection that Victoria had spent years hoping to hear directed at herself. The truth unfolded with devastating clarity. The scholars had fallen collectively in love with Ava, this damaged girl who needed protection and care in ways that awakened their dormant capacity for tenderness. They had decided years ago that Eva should inherit the Montgomery empire, that she deserved the security and stability that wealth could provide. Victoria was merely an obstacle, the biological heir standing between their beloved and the future they envisioned for her. So, they had orchestrated an elaborate deception. They kept Victoria focused on Damien, using her obvious infatuation to blind her to their true intentions. They encouraged her father's belief that she would eventually marry one of them, ensuring he did not seek outside suitors who might actually form genuine connections with his daughter. They created the illusion of competition while actually working in perfect unity toward a goal that required Victoria to remain exactly where she was, lovesick and distracted, until they found a way to transfer her inheritance to Eva. Thomas spoke about the legal mechanisms they were implementing, ways to gradually shift control of Montgomery Global to a trust that Eva could access. Samuel outlined the political connections they were cultivating, relationships that would support such an unprecedented move when the time came. And through it all, Damien remained silent, his lack of protest serving as tacit approval of the conspiracy. Victoria stood frozen behind the column, her heart fracturing into pieces so small she wondered if it could ever be reassembled. Every kind word they had ever spoken to her recontextualized itself as manipulation. Every smile became a lie. Every moment of what she had interpreted as warmth revealed itself as calculated strategy. She had grown up surrounded by these men, had trusted them as brothers, had loved one of them with desperate intensity, and all of it had been built on foundations of pure deceit. The conversation turned to mocking assessment of Victoria's character. Julian described her as pathetically naive, too sheltered by privilege to recognize manipulation even when it danced in front of her face. Marcus called her devotion to Damien both convenient and sad, a weakness they had exploited with embarrassing ease. Ethan expressed mild guilt about deceiving her, but justified it by emphasizing Eva's greater need for security and protection. They spoke about Victoria as though she were a problem to be managed rather than a person deserving of honesty and respect. When they finally dispersed to their separate wings of the mansion, Victoria remained behind the column for a long time, her body shaking with rage and grief so intense she thought she might vomit. Every assumption she had built her identity around had been revealed as fantasy. The family she thought she belonged to had been systematically betraying her for years. The love she had nurtured for Damien was not just unrequited, but actively exploited. Even her father, who surely must know more than he admitted, had failed to protect her from this elaborate deception. Victoria made her way back to her bedroom in a daze, her mind working with new clarity born from devastation. She had been raised to be soft and accommodating, to value harmony and trust, to see the best in people. Those qualities had made her the perfect victim. No more. Something cold and hard crystallized in her chest where her broken heart had been. Something that felt remarkably like the ruthlessness her father had always praised in the scholars but never encouraged in his daughter. By morning, Victoria had made her decision. She would not confront the scholars or expose their conspiracy. She would not beg her father for protection or understanding. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Instead, she would do the one thing none of them had anticipated. She would remove herself from the equation entirely in a way that destroyed their careful plans while securing her own independence. She would marry Hector Kingston. The decision was radical and irreversible, a nuclear option that would incinerate every bridge she had ever built. Hector was everything her father and the scholars despised. He had clawed his way up from absolute poverty, building a shipping empire through sheer brutality and determination. His company, Kingston Maritime, was Montgomery Global's primary competitor, a thorn in Richard's side that had been growing more problematic each year. Hector was crude where the scholars were refined, blunt where they were diplomatic, violent where they preferred manipulation. He was also, Victoria knew from business intelligence reports she had secretly accessed, a man who took what he wanted and protected what was his with ferocious intensity. Marrying him would accomplish multiple objectives. It would remove her from her father's control and the scholars' manipulation. It would position her as heir to a competing empire rather than the Montgomery legacy. Most importantly, it would align her with someone powerful enough to withstand any retaliation her father might attempt. Victoria had met Hector Kingston exactly twice, both times at industry conferences, where he had treated her with the bare minimum of courtesy required by social convention. He was in his late 30s, nearly 15 years her senior, with the kind of hard physicality that came from years of manual labor before wealth found him. His face was all harsh angles and weathered skin, his hands scarred and calloused, his eyes holding depths that promised both danger and unwavering loyalty to those he claimed as his own. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, and he made no effort to cultivate charm or social graces. What he possessed instead was raw power, barely contained behind expensive suits. The kind of primal dominance that made civilized men uncomfortable and weak women flutter with confused attraction. Victoria felt neither attraction nor fear. She felt only cold calculation about how to leverage his ambition and her pedigree into a mutually beneficial arrangement. She called his office using a burner phone purchased specifically for this purpose, making her request directly to Hector himself rather than going through layers of assistants. She wanted to meet privately to discuss a business proposition that would benefit them both. To his credit, Hector agreed immediately, his curiosity apparently piqued by the Montgomery heiress reaching out to her father's competitor. They met in a private room at an upscale restaurant, the kind of neutral territory where they could speak without interruption or surveillance. Hector arrived exactly on time, his massive frame somehow making the expensive suit look like costume rather than natural clothing. He sat across from Victoria with the patience of a predator, willing to wait for prey to reveal itself. Victoria wasted no time on pleasantries or subtlety. She explained that she wanted to marry him, that she was prepared to bring her inheritance and business knowledge into his empire, that she would facilitate the merger of Montgomery Global with Kingston Maritime in exchange for his protection and partnership. She did not mention love or even affection, framing the proposal as pure strategic alliance between two parties with aligned interests. Hector studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes missing nothing. He asked why she was willing to abandon her family and betray her father. Victoria met his gaze without flinching, explaining that her family had already betrayed her, that her father valued his orphaned prodigies more than his biological daughter, that she was merely removing herself from a situation where she had no value or agency. Something shifted in Hector's expression, a flash of understanding or perhaps respect. He told her bluntly that he had no interest in love or romance, that he had built his empire through ruthless pragmatism rather than sentiment, that marriage to her made strategic sense for multiple reasons. He would gain legitimacy and access to networks his rough origins had always kept just beyond reach. She would gain protection and resources to build something entirely her own, free from her father's suffocating control. They agreed on terms with the cold efficiency of a business contract. Hector would marry her within the week, before her father could interfere or the scholars could implement countermeasures. He would provide financial resources and physical protection. In exchange, Victoria would use her knowledge of Montgomery Global's operations to facilitate its eventual absorption into Kingston Maritime, would leverage her social connections to smooth Hector's entry into circles that had previously excluded him, and would maintain absolute loyalty to their partnership regardless of personal feelings. The wedding was arranged with brutal speed. Hector obtained a marriage license through connections that probably involved bribery, but which Victoria chose not to examine too closely. The ceremony took place in a small chapel with only Hector's younger brother, Marcus Kingston, as witness. Victoria wore a simple white dress, purchased off the rack that morning, no veil or flowers or any of the elaborate trappings she had once imagined for her wedding day. She called her father from the chapel steps immediately after signing the marriage certificate, informing him with ice-cold precision that she had married Hector Kingston and would no longer be residing at the Montgomery estate or participating in family business. Richard's explosion of rage could be heard even though the phone was not on speaker. He called her a traitor, a fool, an ungrateful child who had destroyed everything he built. He threatened disinheritance, legal action, total exile from everything she had ever known. Victoria listened without emotion, then informed him that she had already transferred all personally held assets beyond his reach, that she had copies of documents that would make any legal action against her very embarrassing for Montgomery Global, and that she considered their family relationship terminated as of that moment. She hung up before he could respond, then turned off her phone and handed it to Hector to destroy. That life was over. A new one was beginning. The Montgomery mansion erupted in chaos when news of the marriage reached the scholars. Ethan immediately began calculating damage control strategies, trying to determine if the marriage could be annulled or if Victoria could still be manipulated back into compliance. Marcus worked to secure Montgomery Global's computer systems against potential corporate espionage. Julian began drafting public statements to minimize reputational damage. Nathan analyzed the financial implications with growing horror as he realized how thoroughly Victoria's defection compromised their careful plans. But it was Damien's reaction that would have given Victoria dark satisfaction if she had witnessed it. For the first time in the years the scholars had known him, Damien Steele lost his legendary composure. He stood in the library where they had plotted against Victoria, his grey eyes wild with something that looked remarkably like panic, and said with absolute certainty that they had underestimated her catastrophically. She had not acted out of emotional desperation or impulsive rebellion. She had outplayed them with strategy so ruthless it could have come from Richard Montgomery himself. Ava Hartley, the gentle foster daughter they were all trying to protect, asked what they should do now. For once, none of the brilliant scholars had a good answer. Their careful conspiracy had assumed Victoria would remain in place, manipulable and distracted, until they found a way to transfer her inheritance legally. They had never anticipated she would simply remove herself from the board entirely, taking her inheritance and future with her. Richard Montgomery reacted with predictable fury and vindictiveness. Within 24 hours of learning about the marriage, he moved to freeze all of Victoria's assets, cancel her credit cards, and remove her name from every Montgomery Global account and trust fund. He contacted every business associate, every family friend, every social connection Victoria had ever made, informing them that his daughter had betrayed him and should be treated accordingly. He used his considerable influence to ensure that doors, which had always opened effortlessly for the Montgomery heiress, would now remain firmly closed to Mrs. Victoria Kingston. The campaign of isolation was comprehensive and brutal. Former friends stopped returning Victoria's calls. Social invitations ceased arriving. Business contacts who had once been eager to meet with her suddenly had perpetually full calendars. Even charitable organizations, where Victoria had volunteered for years, politely suggested that her continued involvement was no longer appropriate. Richard had effectively erased her from the social and business circles that had defined her entire existence. Victoria discovered the extent of her father's retaliation when she attempted to access her bank accounts and found them completely frozen. Credit cards were declined at every establishment. Investments she had thought were in her name turned out to be held in trusts her father controlled. Even the jewelry she had inherited from her mother was catalogued as Montgomery family property rather than personal assets. Years of privilege evaporated overnight, leaving her with nothing but the clothes she had packed and the uncertain protection of a man she barely knew. Hector observed her systematic dismantling with an expression that held no sympathy, but a grim kind of approval. He told her with characteristic bluntness that she needed to understand what real poverty felt like, that her previous life had been built on sand and false security, that true power came only from what you built yourself rather than what you inherited. He gave her a credit card with a modest monthly limit and told her to make it work, offering no explanation of what standard of living that amount should support. The first month of marriage was brutal education in humility. Victoria had never grocery shopped in her life, had never worried about the price of anything, had never needed to distinguish between necessity and luxury. Now she stood in discount stores comparing unit prices on generic products, her face burning with shame as other shoppers occasionally recognized the former Montgomery heiress reduced to clipping coupons. The modest apartment Hector had given her was clean but sparse, nothing like the luxury she had always known, and she had to learn basic household tasks that staff had always handled invisibly. Hector provided no comfort or reassurance during this adjustment. Their marriage was not based on affection or partnership, but on strategic alliance, and he clearly believed that testing her resolve was part of ensuring she would not become a liability. He worked 18-hour days, building his empire, coming home to the apartment only to sleep, treating Victoria with distant politeness that made clear she was a useful asset rather than a romantic partner. Victoria threw herself into proving she was worth more than her inheritance. She took a position as assistant manager at one of Hector's shipping warehouses, starting at the bottom of an organization she would theoretically someday help lead. The warehouse workers treated her with open hostility, seeing her as the boss's trophy wife playing at working class. Someone who would quit the moment real work chafed her soft hands. They made her prove herself through months of grueling labor, impossible deadlines, and casual cruelty designed to drive her away. She learned to operate forklifts and inventory management systems. She memorized shipping routes and customs regulations. She developed calluses on her hands and permanent aches in her back from manual labor her body had never been trained for. She worked 10-hour shifts, then went home to study logistics textbooks and business management theory, determined to understand Hector's empire from the ground up, rather than relying on theoretical knowledge from her privileged education. Gradually, grudgingly, the warehouse workers stopped treating her as an outsider. They recognized dedication when they saw it, respected the fact that she did not ask for special treatment or use her marriage to Hector as a shield against legitimate criticism. An older woman named Rosa became an unexpected mentor, teaching Victoria the unwritten rules of blue-collar survival with gruff kindness that reminded her painfully of the maternal love she had lost when her mother died years ago. 6 months into the marriage, Victoria had transformed from pampered heiress to competent warehouse manager. She understood supply chains and labor relations, could read profit margins and shipping manifests, knew how to motivate exhausted workers and resolve conflicts before they escalated. More importantly, she had earned genuine respect from people who cared nothing for her pedigree and everything for her work ethic and competence. It was during this period of transformation that Victoria discovered she was pregnant. The realization hit with the force of a freight train, unexpected and overwhelming. She and Hector maintained a physical relationship that was intense but emotionally sterile, passion without romance, release without vulnerability. Neither had discussed children or considered the possibility of permanently binding themselves through shared parentage. Their marriage was supposed to be strategic, potentially temporary, easily dissolved if circumstances changed. A child complicated everything. Victoria carried the secret for weeks, her body changing in subtle ways only she noticed, while she wrestled with implications that terrified her. She had married Hector to escape manipulation and secure independence, not to become permanently tethered to a man who viewed her as a business arrangement. Yet the life growing inside her demanded consideration beyond her own strategic interests. The decision was taken from her hands when she collapsed at the warehouse during a particularly demanding shift involving a last-minute shipment that had to be processed before deadline. Co-workers rushed her to the emergency room, where doctors confirmed what she already knew. She was 4 months pregnant, dangerously dehydrated and malnourished from working too hard while ignoring her body's needs. The hospital called Hector as her emergency contact, and he arrived with speed that surprised her. His reaction defied all expectations. The cold businessman vanished, replaced by someone protective and possessive in ways he had never been before. He wanted to know why she had hidden the pregnancy, why she was still working in conditions unsuitable for expectant mothers, why she had not immediately informed him of circumstances that changed absolutely everything. Victoria watched him pace her hospital room, his usual iron control fracturing, and realized with shock that Hector Kingston was actually capable of caring about something beyond strategic advantage. He informed her with no room for argument that she would stop working at the warehouse immediately. She would have the best medical care money could buy. She would want for nothing throughout the pregnancy. Their child would be raised with every advantage, every opportunity, every resource his considerable wealth could provide. The intensity with which he delivered these declarations revealed emotions he typically kept locked behind walls of pragmatism and calculation. Victoria found herself crying for the first time since her wedding day, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief at discovering she had not married a complete monster. Hector was ruthless in business and emotionally stunted in ways that would probably never fully heal. But he possessed a fierce capacity for protecting those he considered his, and apparently both she and their unborn child now fell into that category, regardless of the transactional origins of their marriage. The pregnancy transformed their relationship in subtle but profound ways. Hector became attentive without being affectionate, ensuring Victoria had everything she needed while maintaining emotional distance that frustrated her increasingly. He hired household staff to manage cooking and cleaning, insisted she rest adequately, monitored her medical appointments with thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. He moved them from the modest apartment to a spacious penthouse with every luxury, as though her pregnancy had finally made her worthy of the comfort he could easily afford. Yet he never spoke of love or emotional connection or any of the softer sentiments that typically accompanied impending parenthood. Their conversations remained focused on logistics and practicalities. When the baby moved for the first time, Victoria wanted to share the wonder of that moment with someone who cared, but Hector was in meetings she was not allowed to interrupt. When she experienced complications that required brief hospitalization, he ensured she had excellent care, but did not stay with her, sending his brother Marcus to sit with her instead. Marcus Kingston proved to be surprisingly good company during those long hospital hours. Unlike his older brother, Marcus possessed emotional intelligence and social skills that made conversation easy and comfortable. He was in his early 30s, handsome in conventional ways that Hector was not, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that suggested genuine kindness rather than calculated charm. He worked as Hector's right-hand man in Kingston Maritime, handling the diplomatic aspects of business that Hector's rough edges made difficult. Marcus asked Victoria about her pregnancy, her adjustment to marriage, her feelings about impending motherhood with what seemed like genuine interest rather than polite obligation. He shared stories about Hector's childhood, painting a picture of a man shaped by trauma and deprivation in ways that explained his emotional limitations without excusing them. Victoria found herself confiding thoughts she had not spoken aloud to anyone, admitting her fears about raising a child with a father who could not access normal human emotion, worrying that she had condemned her baby to growing up starved for affection just as she was. Marcus listened without judgment, then offered perspective that shifted something fundamental in how Victoria understood her husband. Hector had raised him after their mother died, had worked multiple jobs to keep them both fed and housed, had sacrificed any possibility of normal adolescence to ensure Marcus had opportunities Hector never got. Everything Hector built, every ruthless decision he made, came from bone-deep terror of ever being powerless and poor again. His emotional limitations were not indifference, but protective numbness developed by a child who could not afford feelings when survival required constant vigilance. The insight did not make Victoria love Hector, but it helped her understand him in ways that made their strange marriage slightly less lonely. She stopped expecting emotional support he was not capable of giving, and instead focused on building a life that would give her child the stability and love she had lost when her own father chose the scholars over her. The baby arrived on a cold January morning, a daughter with Hector's dark eyes and Victoria's delicate features. They named her Isabel Grace Kingston, and she was perfect in ways that made Victoria's chest physically ache. Hector held his daughter with trembling hands, this man who commanded shipping empires and intimidated hardened businessmen, utterly undone by 7 pounds of helpless humanity, who gazed at him with absolute trust. Fatherhood transformed Hector in ways Victoria had not thought possible. He became softer, more present, more willing to engage emotionally in at least this one relationship, even if he remained distant with Victoria. He cancelled business meetings to be present for pediatrician appointments. He rocked Isabel for hours when she would not sleep, singing Portuguese lullabies from his childhood in a surprisingly gentle voice. He hired the best nanny money could buy, but insisted on being hands-on, involved in ways that shocked his business associates. Victoria watched her husband fall completely in love with their daughter and felt complicated emotions she could not fully process. Part of her was grateful that Isabel would never feel the emotional starvation Victoria experienced in her marriage. Part of her was jealous that Hector could access such depth of feeling for their child, but remained completely closed off to Victoria herself. Mostly, she felt determined to build something for herself and Isabel that did not depend entirely on Hector's goodwill or financial support. With Hector's cautious approval and financial backing, Victoria launched a logistics consulting firm targeting small businesses that could not afford the services of major companies like Montgomery Global or Kingston Maritime. She called it Nightingale Solutions, a name that referenced both her maiden name and the idea of bringing light to businesses struggling in darkness. She worked from home initially, building a client base through competence and reasonable pricing rather than connections or pedigree. The business grew slowly but steadily. Victoria possessed her father's strategic mind and years of insider knowledge about how major logistics companies operated. She could help small manufacturers optimize their supply chains, assist struggling retailers with inventory management, advise expanding businesses on distribution strategies. Within a year, Nightingale Solutions had 20 clients and was turning modest profit. Within 2 years, Victoria had hired staff and moved into office space, building something genuinely hers rather than inherited or dependent on her husband. Isabel grew into a bright, curious toddler who split her time between Victoria's focused care and Hector's indulgent affection. She was loved fiercely by both parents in different ways, never wanting for attention or resources. Victoria was determined that her daughter would grow up confident and valued, never doubting her importance the way Victoria had been taught to doubt her own worth by men who pretended to care while actually serving their own interests. 3 years into their marriage, Victoria and Hector had settled into a comfortable partnership that resembled friendship more than romance. They shared genuine respect for each other's business acumen, coordinated their schedules around Isabel's needs, and maintained a physical relationship that remained satisfying despite lacking emotional intimacy. It was not the marriage Victoria had dreamed of as a girl, but it was honest and functional in ways her previous life had never been. Then Richard Montgomery died suddenly of a massive heart attack, and everything changed again. The news reached Victoria through a lawyer rather than the scholars, informing her that despite their estrangement, she remained her father's sole biological heir. Montgomery Global Logistics, worth billions, belonged to her outright, unless she chose to contest the will in favor of the elaborate trust Richard had been constructing to benefit the scholars and Ava. Victoria felt nothing learning of her father's death, no grief or satisfaction, or any of the complicated emotions she might have expected. He had been dead to her since the day she walked out of his mansion and into Hector's life. The inheritance was simply an unexpected complication, requiring strategic management rather than emotional processing. The scholars, however, reacted with panic bordering on hysteria. Everything they had worked for, every careful manipulation and long-term strategy, depended on controlling Montgomery Global's future. Richard's sudden death before their legal mechanisms were fully in place meant that Victoria, the woman they had betrayed and dismissed, now held absolute power over the empire they had planned to inherit through Ava. Ethan Cole was the first to reach out, his message carefully worded to express condolences while also requesting a meeting to discuss the company's future. Victoria ignored it. Marcus Webb tried next, appealing to their shared history and suggesting that surely she did not want to see her father's legacy destroyed by their estrangement. Victoria blocked his number. One by one, all 7 scholars attempted contact through various channels, their desperation growing more obvious with each ignored overture. Damian Steele finally appeared in person at Victoria's office, bypassing her receptionist through sheer force of personality that had once made her foolish heart race. He looked the same as always, cold and beautiful and utterly controlled, though Victoria noticed new lines around his eyes that suggested stress and sleepless nights. He said he needed to speak with her about Montgomery Global, that they had to discuss the company's future, that surely she understood she could not simply destroy everything her father built out of spite. Victoria looked at him, this man she had loved with desperate intensity for years and felt absolutely nothing. No lingering attraction, no residual pain, not even satisfaction at his obvious discomfort. He was simply irrelevant. A character from a previous chapter of her life that held no power over her present. She told him with perfect calm that she had no intention of discussing anything with him, that the company's future was none of his concern, that he should leave her office before she had security remove him. Damian made the mistake of mentioning Eva, appealing to Victoria's supposed kindness and compassion for a vulnerable young woman who had never asked for any of this. Victoria's cold composure cracked just enough to show the rage burning beneath. She informed Damian with ice in her voice that Eva had benefited for years from a conspiracy that required Victoria's systematic manipulation and betrayal. Whatever happened to Eva now was entirely on the scholars who had used her as justification for their cruelty, while never considering what she might actually want or need. The meeting ended with Damian's departure, and Victoria's hands shaking from adrenaline and suppressed fury. Hector found her sitting at her desk an hour later, staring at nothing, and asked what had happened. Victoria explained the entire history she had never fully detailed before. The years of manipulation and betrayal, the conspiracy to steal her inheritance for Eva's benefit, the systematic destruction of her trust and innocence by men who claimed to be her family. Hector listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively darker as the full scope of the scholar's actions became clear. When Victoria finished, he told her with absolute certainty that she should destroy Montgomery Global completely, liquidate every asset and salt the earth so thoroughly that nothing could ever grow there again. It would be justice, revenge, and strategic elimination of a major competitor, all in one satisfying action. The suggestion was tempting. Victoria could admit that part of her wanted to watch everything her father built turn to ash, wanted the scholars to understand viscerally what it felt like to lose everything. But there were thousands of employees at Montgomery Global who had done nothing wrong, people whose livelihoods depended on the company's continued operation. Destroying the company would hurt innocent people more than it would truly punish the scholars. Instead, Victoria made a different choice. She restructured Montgomery Global completely, removing every scholar from positions of power and replacing them with outside executives who owed her personal loyalty. She dissolved the trusts and mechanisms her father had been building, reclaiming full control of assets the scholars had tried to claim through legal maneuvering. She kept Eva on a generous stipend, but made clear that the young woman's future was her own responsibility, not something Victoria would manage or control. Most devastatingly, Victoria merged Montgomery Global with Kingston Maritime, creating a new super company that dominated North American shipping and logistics. The Montgomery name disappeared entirely, erased as though it had never existed. The scholars lost not just their expected inheritance, but also their positions, their reputations, their carefully constructed futures. They were not destroyed, but they were reduced to exactly what they had been before Richard Montgomery found them, talented but poor young men with nothing but potential and their own abilities to rely on. The business world watched in fascination as the Montgomery heiress transformed from tragic runaway bride to ruthless CEO. Victoria gave exactly one interview about the merger, explaining with perfect composure that she was simply consolidating family assets and removing inefficiencies from her late father's empire. She never mentioned the scholars by name, never explained her true motivations, never gave them the satisfaction of public acknowledgement of their significance. Damien Steele attempted one final contact, a letter delivered to Victoria's home rather than her office. In it, he wrote with uncharacteristic emotion that he was sorry, that they had been wrong to manipulate her, that he understood if she could never forgive them, but wanted her to know that their actions had come from love for Ava rather than hatred of Victoria. He ended with the observation that perhaps Victoria and he were more similar than he had realized, both capable of cold ruthlessness when circumstances required it. Victoria burned the letter without finishing it, not interested in his excuses or self-serving comparisons. The scholars had made their choices and now lived with consequences. She had built a new life from the ruins they created, had found strength she never knew she possessed, had transformed from naive heiress into formidable businesswoman. Their opinion of her, their regrets, their belated recognition of her worth meant absolutely nothing. 5 years after her wedding to Hector, Victoria stood in the executive office of what was now Kingston Global Logistics, looking out at the city skyline with Isabel playing quietly in the corner with expensive toys. She thought about the girl she had been, desperately craving Damien's attention and her father's approval, willing to ignore obvious manipulation because acknowledging it would shatter her entire worldview. That girl was gone, replaced by someone harder and more capable, someone who had learned that true power came from what you built rather than what you were given. Hector entered the office without knocking, bringing coffee and kissing Isabel's head before standing beside Victoria at the window. Their marriage had evolved into genuine partnership over the years, affection without passion, respect without romance. He asked if she ever regretted her choices, whether she wished she had handled things differently with her father and the scholars. Victoria considered the question seriously, then shook her head. Everything she valued in her life, everything that made her genuinely happy, had come from that moment of betrayal and the choices she made in response. Isabel, her business, her hard-won competence and independence, her marriage based on honesty rather than pretty lies. All of it had been forged in the fire of the scholar's conspiracy. If she had remained the naive heiress her father raised, she would have been a puppet forever, manipulated by men who pretended to care while actually serving their own interests. She had gone from ruin to power, from broken trust to strategic alliance, from desperate love to fierce independence. The Montgomery heiress was dead, and from her ashes had risen someone infinitely stronger. Victoria Kingston looked at her reflection in the window, at the successful businesswoman and protective mother she had become, and knew with absolute certainty that she had won in every way that mattered. The scholars had underestimated her catastrophically, assuming she would remain manipulable and weak forever. They had destroyed her naivety, but awakened her ruthlessness, taught her that betrayal could be survived and used as fuel for transformation. She had taken their cruelty and forged it into strength, had transformed their conspiracy into her liberation. And somewhere in the city, 7 brilliant men were learning the lesson Victoria had learned years ago in a library alcove behind a marble column. That sometimes the people you underestimate are the most dangerous of all. That manipulation has consequences, that the heir you dismiss might become the CEO who destroys everything you hope to steal. Victoria turned away from the window, done with reflections and regrets. She had a company to run, a daughter to raise, a future to build from the ruins of her past. The Montgomery legacy was dead and buried. Long live Kingston Global, built on honesty and ruthlessness in equal measure, ruled by a woman who had learned that true power came not from inheritance, but from transformation.